Clement didn't just break my heart, he executed it. In front of 300 people, the man I loved for 6 years didn't say I do. He said, I never will. The microphone screeched like a dying bird before Clement's voice boomed through the cathedral. This was a mistake, he muttered. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the exit. Then he did the unthinkable. He grabbed my hand and ripped the heirloom ring from my finger. I gasped as the metal scraped my skin, but the sting was nothing compared to the sound of 300 phones rising in unison. I was a spectacle, a viral tragedy. My knees began to buckle, but then the air in the room changed. It went cold, heavy. He moved like a predator, silent and dangerous. This wasn't a guest. This was a storm in a black tie. He reached the altar and ignored the priest, ignored the coward, and looked only at me. He reached out, his hand warm as he cradled my face. His thumb wiped away a tear. "Why are you crying for a boy?" he whispered, his accent deep and smooth, "when a king is standing right here?" He looked me in the eyes and said the 4 words that would change my life and put a target on my back forever. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you like this video and drop a comment. Do you think Maya should trust this stranger? Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment Maya enters the Korean underground. It's about to get much more dangerous. The silence that followed Tae-min's arrival was heavier than the screams that had preceded it. It was a suffocating velvet quiet that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the cathedral. Clement was frozen halfway down the aisle, his face a distorted mask of confusion and growing fear. He looked like a man who had just realized he wasn't the protagonist of this story anymore. He was just a footnote. Kang Tae-min didn't spare him a glance. His focus was entirely on me, his eyes dark and unreadable, like the surface of a deep well. Every step he took toward the altar was a rhythmic, calculated strike against the marble floor. The guests, who seconds ago had been filming my downfall with greedy eyes, suddenly lowered their phones. There was something about the way he carried himself, the sheer lethal authority radiating from his frame, that it made it feel illegal to keep recording. When he reached me, the scent of expensive sandalwood and something metallic, like cold rain on steel, filled my senses. My breath hitched. I was still shaking, my hands trembling so violently that the white roses in my bouquet shed petals like drops of snow. I felt small, shattered and exposed in my lace gown, but as Tae-min stepped into my space, the world narrowed until it was just the 2 of us. He didn't say a word at first. He simply reached out and took my hand. His skin was warm, his grip firm and grounding. With his other hand, he reached into the pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a silk handkerchief, gently dabbing the mascara from my cheek. The tenderness was so unexpected, it hurt more than Clement's cruelty. "Maya," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what had happened. He looked toward the priest, who was clutching his Bible as if it were a shield. Then Tae-min turned his head slightly toward the congregation. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He simply let his gaze sweep over the room, from the front row to the very back. It was a look that promised a very specific kind of ending to anyone who dared to speak or laugh. The whispers died instantly. The church became a tomb. "The wedding," Tae-min announced, his voice carrying to the furthest corner of the rafters, "is not over. It is merely beginning." He looked back at me, a faint, dangerous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Are you ready to stop being a victim, Maya? Because if you take my hand, I will make sure no one ever looks down on you again. But once you step into my shadow, there is no light to go back to." I looked at his hand, then at the open door where Clement had tried to flee. I could feel the eyes of 300 people waiting for me to break. Instead, I placed my hand in his. The priest's hands shook, the gold leaf on his Bible catching the flickering candlelight as he looked from the terrifying stranger to the marriage license now resting on the altar. A heavy, suffocating tension hung in the air, broken only by the sound of Clement's retreating footsteps faltering near the heavy oak doors. He had stopped, turned, and was now staring back, his mouth agape as he watched another man claim the space he had just abandoned. Tae-min's hand remained wrapped around mine, a solid anchor in the middle of the storm. He leaned closer to the priest, his voice dropping to a low, commanding frequency that brooked no argument. "The names are already there," he said, his gaze shifting briefly to the document. "All that is missing is the final vow." The congregation was a sea of frozen faces. I could feel the heat of their judgment, the weight of their pity, and the hum of 100 silent cameras waiting for my next move. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs. I looked down at the license. It was surreal. My name, Maya Brooks, printed in elegant script next to his, Kang Tae-min. It was impossible. It was a trap. But as I looked at the dark bruise already forming on my finger where Clement had ripped the ring away, I realized that any trap was better than the public execution I was currently enduring. "Do you, Kang Tae-min," the priest began, his voice cracking, "take this woman to be your wedded wife?"
Tae-min didn't hesitate. He didn't blink. He looked directly into my eyes, his expression a mixture of predatory focus and strange, dark promise. "I do," he said. The words weren't a soft, romantic promise. They were a declaration of ownership. The priest turned to me, his eyes pleading for me to end this madness. "And do you, Maya Brooks?" The world seemed to slow down. I could see Clement in the distance, his face flushing with a mix of regret and sudden wounded pride. He expected me to cry. He expected me to run after him. He expected me to be the victim he had created. I looked at Tae-min, this beautiful, dangerous mystery who had appeared out of the shadows with my name already written on a legal document. I didn't know who he was, but I knew who he wasn't. He wasn't the man who had just discarded me like trash. "I do," I whispered, the words gaining strength as they left my lips. "I do." A collective gasp swept through the church like a physical wind. Before the priest could even pronounce us husband and wife, Tae-min pulled a ring from his vest, a band of platinum set with a diamond so large it seemed to swallow the light of the room. He slid it onto my finger, the cold metal a stark contrast to the heat of his touch. "From this moment," he murmured, leaning down so only I could hear, "you belong to the house of Kang, and I protect what is mine." The roar of the engine was the only thing that drowned out the frantic beating of my heart as the black SUV tore away from the cathedral. Behind us, the flashing lights of the paparazzi faded into a blur of neon streaks, but the weight of the man sitting beside me in the shadows was impossible to ignore. Tae-min didn't speak. He sat with one leg crossed over the other, his profile etched in the cold light of the passing street lamps, looking more like a monarch than a groom. We didn't head toward the reception hall where my family waited with tiered cake and expensive champagne. Instead, the car wound through the city's labyrinthine streets until we reached a towering monolith of glass and steel that pierced the clouds, the Skyline Fortress. The garage doors slid open with a heavy mechanical hum that signaled the end of my old life. We bypassed the lobby entirely, entering a private elevator that required Tae-min's biometric scan. As we ascended, the pressure in my ears mounted, mirroring the rising dread in my chest. When the doors finally hissed open, I stepped out onto polished obsidian floors that reflected the sprawling, glittering city below like a dark ocean. The penthouse was a masterpiece of cold luxury and high-tech isolation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the world I had just been snatched from, but the glass felt inches thick, reinforced against more than just the wind. There were no family photos.
Here, no warmth, only sleek minimalist furniture and a wall of monitors in the corner flickering with security feeds from every angle of the building. "This is home now," Tae-min said, finally breaking the silence as he unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket. He tossed it onto a leather sofa, revealing the sharp lines of a shoulder holster snuggled against his white shirt. The sight of the weapon made the reality hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just a bride who had been saved. I was a woman who had been relocated to a command center. I looked down at the massive diamond on my finger, then back at the man who had bought my loyalty with a single vow. "Why me?" I whispered, my voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "You had that license ready. You weren't a guest at that wedding, Tae-min. You were a predator waiting for the kill." He walked toward the window, looking out at the city as if he owned every light within it. "Clement was a distraction you didn't need, Maya, and I am a solution you haven't realized you're looking for." He turned slightly, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "You're safe here, but don't mistake this for a playground. This is a fortress, and from tonight, you are the only thing inside it that matters to me." As a distant siren wailed somewhere far below, I realized with a shiver that while the world couldn't get in, I could no longer get out. The silence of the penthouse was not the peaceful kind. It was a heavy, surgical stillness that made every rustle of my silk gown sound like a gunshot. Tae-min had disappeared into an office, leaving me to wander the labyrinth of cold marble and shadows. I needed to feel something other than the ghost of Clement's rejection, so I pushed open a set of double doors at the end of the living area, expecting a library or a guest room. Instead, I found a room that breathed differently. It was a walk-in closet, but not for clothes. Behind glass casings, dozens of suits hung in shades of midnight and charcoal, but beneath them, on a velvet-lined island, lay an array of steel that turned my blood to ice. My hand hovered over a sleek matte black handgun, its surface reflecting the dim ambient light. Next to it was a curved dagger, the blade so polished it looked like a sliver of the moon. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the cold metal of the pistol. This wasn't protection, this was a profession. "It's heavier than it looks, isn't it?" I spun around, nearly knocking over a display. Tae-min stood in the doorway, his tie gone, his top buttons undone. He didn't look like the savior from the cathedral anymore. He looked like the reason people prayed for sunrise. "You told me you were a businessman," I whispered, my voice caught in my throat. I looked from the weapon back at his calm, dark eyes. "What kind of business requires a room full of death?" Tae-min walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was standing so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He reached down, picked up the handgun I had been touching, and checked the chamber with a practiced, terrifying flick of his wrist. "I am a businessman, Maya. I manage territories, loyalties, and debts," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal silk. "In Seoul, they call me the Shadow King. Here, I am the head of the Kang Syndicate. The man you almost married today was a coward who played at being a man. The man you did marry is a ghost who runs this city's underworld." He set the gun back down and tilted my chin up, forcing me to look at the cold reality in his gaze. "The world thinks I married you to save your reputation. They're wrong. I married you because in my world, a king needs a queen who has nothing left to lose. You were shattered today, Maya, and shattered glass is the sharpest weapon there is. The reality of the silk on my skin and the blood on his hands finally fused. I wasn't just in a fortress, I was in a war room, and my husband was the commander. The transition from the relative silence of the closet to chaos happened in a heartbeat. 1 second, I was reeling from the revelation of Tae-min's identity. The next, a deafening crack fractured the air. The floor-to-ceiling glass of the living room didn't just break, it detonated. Shards of reinforced crystal sprayed across the obsidian floor like a wave of diamonds, and the high-pitched, rhythmic scream of the security alarm tore through the penthouse. Before I could even scream, I was airborne. Tae-min's arm hooked around my waist with the force of a steel cable, slamming me down behind the heavy marble kitchen island. The transition in him was instantaneous and terrifying. The husband who had wiped my tears was gone. In his place stood a predator who had been born for this moment. "Stay down. Do not move until I tell you," he commanded. His voice wasn't panicked. It was a low, lethal vibration that cut through the blaring siren. He didn't reach for the handgun on the velvet island. Instead, he drew the weapon from his shoulder holster with a fluid, terrifying grace. From the shattered window, a black-clad figure swung in on a high-tension cable, boots crunching on the broken glass. He wasn't alone. 2 more shadowed silhouettes appeared on the balcony, the red dots of laser sights dancing across the walls like hungry insects. I pressed my back against the cold marble, my breath coming in jagged gasps. I saw Tae-min rise, just an inch, just enough. The sound of his weapon was rhythmic and precise. 2 shots, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. There was no hesitation, no mercy. He moved with a cold, calculated efficiency that made my stomach churn. A second assassin lunged toward the island, a blade gleaming in the strobe-like flash of the alarm lights. Tae-min didn't even flinch. He caught the man's wrist, and the sound of breaking bone was audible even over the siren. With a brutal twist, he sent the intruder crashing into a glass display.
In less than 60 seconds, the room fell into a horrifying, ringing silence, save for the wail of the alarm. Tae-min stood over the wreckage, his chest barely heaving, his eyes scanning the perimeter with a gaze that felt colder than the wind howling through the broken window. He looked down at his sleeve, where a drop of blood, not his, had stained the white silk. He turned to me, the lethal shadow still lingering in his expression. "I told you, Maya," he said, his voice dropping back into that dark, protective silk as he reached out a hand to pull me up. "There is no light to go back to. They're already coming for you because you're mine." As he pulled me into his chest, I realized with a sickening jolt that the danger wasn't just outside, it was in the very arms that held me. The flashbulbs were more aggressive than the gunfire had been. 3 weeks after the wedding that shattered the internet, the grand ballroom of the Sapphire Hotel was a cage of gold leaf and judging eyes. I walked beside Tae-min, my hand resting on his silk-clad arm, feeling the weight of the emeralds around my neck. I wasn't the weeping girl in the wilted lace anymore. I was draped in a black velvet gown that fit like armor, my hair swept up to reveal a face that had learned to hide its tremors. The room went silent as we descended the grand staircase. The whispers were like the rustle of dry leaves. The Mafia's bride, the girl who traded a loser for a monster. Tae-min didn't lean in to reassure me. He didn't have to. The sheer pressure of his presence forced the crowd to part, their curiosity replaced by a primal instinct to get out of his way. "Keep your head up, Maya," he murmured, his voice a low vibration beneath the orchestral music. "You are the most dangerous woman in this room, simply because you are mine." I was beginning to believe him until I saw the ghost. Standing by the champagne tower, looking disheveled despite his expensive tuxedo, was Clement. He looked smaller than I remembered, paler. When his eyes met mine, his glass tilted, spilling gold liquid onto the white tablecloth. He pushed through a group of socialites, stumbling in his haste to reach us. "Maya?" His voice was a pathetic rasp, stripped of the arrogance he'd used to humiliate me at the altar.
He reached out as if to touch my arm, but he stopped short when Tae-min shifted his weight. The air between the three of us turned into a vacuum. "What are you doing here?" Clement hissed, his eyes darting between my emeralds and the man holding my hand. "Maya, do you have any idea who this is? People are talking. They say he's a butcher. They say you're in danger." I looked at Clement, the man I had cried for, the man I had begged for, and felt nothing but a cold, sharp pity. "The only person who put me in danger was you, Clement," I said, my voice steady, ringing with a clarity that surprised even me. "You threw me away in front of the world. Tae-min gave me a world where no one dares to blink in my presence."
Clement's face flushed a deep, ugly red. Jealousy, late and useless, flared in his eyes. "You're just a trophy to him. He's using you to clean his image." He turned to Tae-min, his voice cracking with a false bravado. "She doesn't belong with someone like you." Tae-min stepped forward, a single inch that felt like a mile. He didn't raise his voice, but the temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. "She belongs exactly where she chooses to be," Tae-min said, his dark eyes locking onto Clement's with a promise of absolute ruin. "And if you ever speak to my wife again, I won't just take your dignity, I'll take everything you have left." Clement backed away, his boots scuffing the floor as the crowd watched the final death of his pride. Tae-min turned back to me, his expression softening just enough for me to see the predator retreating. "Shall we dance?" he asked. As he led me to the center of the floor, I didn't look back. I realized then that the gala wasn't my debut into society, it was my coronation. The air in the hotel suite felt thin, the distant hum of the gala downstairs a fading ghost of the night's earlier tension. Tae-min had stepped out to take a call, a phrase I was beginning to realize was code for something far more violent. In the sudden quiet, a frantic tapping at the balcony door made me gasp. I pulled back the heavy velvet curtain to find Clement, his tuxedo shirt stained with sweat, his eyes wide and bloodshot. Against my better judgment, I slid the glass open. Before I could speak, he was inside, grabbing my shoulders with a desperation that bordered on manic. "You need to listen to me, Clement," he hissed, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and raw fear. "I know why he did it. I know why he was at that wedding." "You need to leave, Clement," I whispered, glancing at the door. "If Tae-min finds you here—" "Tae-min is a monster, Maya. He's not a businessman. He's a butcher." Clement's voice cracked, and he fumbled with his phone, pulling up a grainy, low-light photograph. It showed Tae-min standing over a man in a dark alley, his face cold and indifferent as he held a weapon I recognized from the penthouse. "He didn't save you because he loves you, Helan. He saved you because my father owed his syndicate millions. He took you as collateral. You're not his wife. You're a debt payment." The world tilted. I looked at the emeralds on my wrists, suddenly feeling like they were handcuffs forged in green fire. I remembered the pre-signed marriage license, the way he knew exactly when Clement would fail, the way he looked at me not like a person, but like a prize. "He's using you to get to my family's assets," Clement pleaded, his voice softening into the manipulative tone I had once mistaken for love. "I made a mistake, Maya. I was scared. I didn't want to bring you into this war, so I tried to push you away. But seeing you with him, I can't let him destroy you. I have a car waiting at the service entrance. We can disappear. No deaths, no Mafia, just us." I looked at the door, then back at the man who had abandoned me. Clement represented the life I knew, safe, predictable, and mediocre. He was a liar, but he was a human liar. Tae-min was a god of shadows who had built a throne on my humiliation. Was I a queen, or was I just the most expensive piece of property in Tae-min's portfolio? "Maya?" The voice came from the doorway. It was quiet, steady, and utterly terrifying. Tae-min stood there, his phone back in his pocket, his eyes landing on Clement's hands still resting on my shoulders. The temperature in the room plummeted. I looked at Clement's shaking hands,
Then, at Tae-min's calm, lethal stillness, my heart was a pendulum, swinging between a past that had betrayed me and a future that might kill me. I was torn between the man who had broken my heart and the man who might have bought it. The silence in the room was a living thing, expanding, until the frantic sounds of Clement's breathing seemed like a roar. Tae-min didn't rush in with a weapon drawn. He didn't shout. He simply walked into the center of the suite, his presence so absolute that Clement scrambled backward, tripping over the hem of a heavy curtain. Tae-min's eyes never left mine. He looked at me with a terrifyingly calm clarity, as if he were reading the very thoughts I was trying to hide. "Is it true?" I whispered, the words trembling. "The debt? The collateral? Am I just a line in a ledger to you?" Tae-min stopped a few feet away. He didn't look at the phone in my hand or the man shivering in the corner. "The debt is real," he said, his voice a low, steady chime of truth that cut through Clement's frantic lies. "Your father's failure provided the opportunity, but the choice to stand at that altar, that was mine, and the choice to stay there was yours." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted key card, tossing it onto the bed between us. "Clement is right about one thing, Maya. I am a monster. The world I inhabit will eventually try to swallow you whole. I won't lie to you and call it a fairy tale." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me, cold and protective. "The car Clement mentioned is indeed at the service entrance. My men will let you pass. You can go back to your old life. You can be the girl who was left at the altar, and eventually the world will forget your name." I looked at the keycard, then at Clement, who was watching me with a hopeful, pathetic desperation. Then I looked at Tae-min. His face was a mask of stone, but for the first time I saw a flicker of something raw in his eyes, a silent challenge, or perhaps a plea. "But if you stay," Tae-min said, his voice dropping to a lethal, intimate silk, "you stop being a victim forever. You don't just live in my house, you rule it. You take the name Kang, and with it you take my enemies, my secrets, and my soul. There is no middle ground, there is no turning back. If you stay, you are the Shadow Queen, and the world will never be safe for you again." Clement grabbed my wrist, his touch cold and pleading. "Maya, let's go, please." I looked down at his hand, then up at the man who had offered me a throne built on blood. I realized that going with Clement meant returning to a life of being handled, managed, and eventually discarded again. Staying with Tae-min meant walking into the fire, but it meant walking into it with a crown. I pulled my wrist out of Clement's grip. The choice wasn't about which man I loved, it was about which woman I wanted to become. I took a step toward the man who had bought my debt and claimed my future. "Clement," I said, my voice as cold as the emeralds on my neck, "run while he's still letting you." Exactly 1 year had passed since the marble floors of a cathedral had threatened to swallow me whole, but today the only thing beneath my feet was the reinforced glass of a private boardroom overlooking the Seoul skyline. The woman who had once clutched a bouquet of white roses with trembling hands was dead. In her place sat a woman draped in structured silk the color of midnight, her expression as unreadable as the obsidian desk before her. Across from me, a veteran tycoon from a rival shipping firm fumbled with his fountain pen, his forehead slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. He had expected to negotiate with the Shadow King. He hadn't expected to face the Queen. "The terms are non-negotiable, Mr. Park," I said, my voice a calm, lethal current that silenced the frantic ticking of his expensive watch. I didn't need to shout. I had learned that in the House of Kang, the quietest whispers carried the most weight. I slid a leather-bound contract across the table, a deal that would effectively absorb his fleet into our empire. "You can sign, and your family remains under our protection, or you can walk out that door, and by sunset, you will realize just how cold the world is without Tae-min's shadow." The man looked at me, his eyes searching for a flicker of the victim the tabloids had once feasted upon. He found nothing but a polished, predatory grace. With a shaking hand, he pressed the pen to paper. The deal was done. I stood up, the sharp click of my heels echoing like a heartbeat against the glass. As I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, the door behind me opened. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. The air always shifted when he entered. It became charged, electric, and safe. Tae-min stepped up behind me, his hands resting possessively on my waist. He didn't look at the signed contract on the desk. He looked at my reflection in the glass, his dark eyes burning with a pride that was far more intoxicating than any vow he had made at the altar. "You handled them better than I would have," he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. "They're terrified of you, Maya."
"Good," I replied, leaning back into his strength. "Fear is more reliable than love, but having both, that's an empire." I looked out at the city below, at the thousands of lights flickering like distant stars. A year ago, I was a girl waiting for a man to choose me. Today, I was the woman who chose the world I wanted to rule. The transformation wasn't just complete, it was absolute. I wasn't his collateral anymore. I was his equal. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in shades of blood and gold, I knew that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving the story, I was writing it.